You owe them this house, my daughter shouted, and her husband grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark. Then he shoved me backward into the china cabinet, and I heard the glass crack behind my head before I felt the pain. And here's the part none of them understood as I lay there on my own dining room floor. I smiled. I pushed myself back up using the edge of the table, walked past all four of them without a word, picked up my truck keys from the hook by the garage door, and drove myself to the urgent care clinic on Route 9. What none of them knew was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for almost 4 months. My name is Walter Hendricks. I'm 64 years old. I spent 29 years running a small hardware store in Millbrook, New Hampshire, before I sold it and retired 3 years ago. And this is the story of the 4th of July cookout that ended one chapter of my life and started a much better one. I live in a 4-bedroom farmhouse on Larch Hollow Road, out past the covered bridge, the same house my wife Patricia and I bought back in 1991 when our daughter Renee was barely walking. Patricia died 5 years ago from a stroke that came on so fast the doctors said there was nothing anybody could have done differently, and since then this house has echoed in a way I never got used to. Renee is 36 now, married to a man named Cole for 7 years, and they have two boys, Tucker, who's 8, and Milo, who's 5. The finished basement and the spare bedroom over the garage used to be Renee's old spaces when she was growing up, and they'd mostly sat empty except when the grandboys came to stay over on school breaks. I never gave those rooms a second thought until about 4 months ago, when I started noticing things. Small comments, long pauses in conversation that felt like they were building towards something. Cole's brother, a man named Dean Ferris, had lost his construction business the year before, after a partner skipped town with half the company's equipment and most of its cash, and Dean and his girlfriend Shelby had been sleeping on an air mattress in Cole and Renee's cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Concord ever since. I felt for them, I really did. But underneath that sympathy there was something else growing too. A kind of low hum of suspicion that got louder every time Renee visited and wandered through my house like she was taking inventory. About 3 months before the 4th of July, I sat down with my attorney, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Carol Ann Voss, who had helped me handle the estate paperwork after Patricia passed, and I told her what I'd been noticing. Carol Ann didn't tell me I was imagining things. She told me to document everything, keep my ownership papers and my will updated and locked down, and call her the moment anything crossed a real line. We joked about it, called it the contingency, just something to have in our back pocket. I laughed about it that day in her office. I had no idea how soon I'd need it. 3 weeks before the 4th of July, Renee called me on a Sunday evening while I was out on the porch shelling peas from the garden. She had that particular brightness in her voice, the one she used to fake as a teenager, right before asking to borrow the car for something she didn't want to explain. "Dad," she said, "we were thinking, since everybody's off for the holiday weekend, maybe Dean and Shelby could come out to the farmhouse too. It'd be good for you to really get to know them." I told her that sounded fine, because on the surface, it did. I'd met Dean a few times at family things over the years, always brief, always polite enough, and there wasn't any real reason to say no to a bigger holiday gathering. What I didn't know was that Renee had already talked it over with Cole the night before, the two of them deciding that a cookout, with everybody relaxed and the boys running around, would be the perfect setting to finally bring up the basement and the room over the garage. I found that out much later. At the time, I was just an old man, looking forward to seeing his grandsons, spending the better part of the week before the holiday mowing the backfield, buying enough burgers and ribs to feed a small army, and pulling the folding tables out of the barn so everybody would have somewhere to sit. I even dug out Patricia's old red, white, and blue tablecloth, the one she only used for the 4th, because some habits from 28 years of marriage don't just disappear because the other person isn't there to share them anymore. I wanted that weekend to feel normal, warm, the way the 4th used to feel when Patricia was still alive and the yard was full of kids chasing sparklers after dark. I had no idea that by the time the fireworks were supposed to start, I'd be sitting in an urgent care waiting room instead, holding a bag of ice against the back of my skull. The 4th came in clear and hot, one of those New England summer days where the air smells like cut grass and charcoal smoke from 3 yards over. Renee, Cole, and the boys showed up first around 11, and Dean and Shelby pulled in about half an hour later in a car that Renee mentioned, a little too casually. They'd borrowed from a friend, since Dean's truck had been repossessed back in the spring. The boys tore off toward the tire swing Patricia and I had hung on the old maple tree years ago, and for a while it actually felt like a normal holiday. Shelby complimented the tablecloth and asked polite questions about the hardware store and what retirement was like. Dean talked about the Red Sox game from the night before, and I remember thinking, This isn't so bad. Maybe I've been reading too much into all of it. We ate around 2 in the afternoon, out at the picnic tables under the maple, burgers and corn on the cob and a potato salad. Renee always made the same way her mother used to. The boys had their own little card table off to the side. The adults sat together with Patricia's tablecloth spread out the way it always used to be. About halfway through the meal, Renee set down her fork and looked around slowly, the same way she'd been looking at my house for weeks. "This place is really something, Dad," she said. "4 bedrooms, and it's just you rattling around in here most of the time, isn't it?" I said something simple back. Agreed it was a lot of house for one person. Didn't think much of it in the moment. Cole glanced over at Renee across the table. A quick look I caught, but didn't understand yet. And Dean cleared his throat and started talking about the price of lumber instead, which felt like a deliberate change of subject. I didn't know it then, but that was the calm before the part of the day I would never forget. We hadn't even gotten to the pie yet when Renee set her lemonade down harder than she needed to and said what she'd clearly been building up to through the whole meal. "Dad," she said, "Dean and Shelby are really struggling right now, and you've got a whole basement and a room over the garage just sitting empty. I think it makes sense for them to move out here for a while, just until they get back on their feet." The table went quiet, except for the boys arguing over a card game a few feet away. I set my own fork down slow and told her I understood Dean and Shelby were going through something hard, and I meant that. But my house was my home, not a solution to somebody else's housing problem, and I wasn't comfortable turning it into a permanent arrangement for people I barely knew. Renee's face changed fast. The easy smile from earlier dropped right off it. "It's not permanent, Dad." Her voice had an edge to it now. "It's just until they save up. And that basement just sits there collecting dust while Dean's brother sleeps on an air mattress in our living room." Cole jumped in then, trying to sound reasonable, but landing somewhere closer to demanding. "Walt, come on. It's not that big a favor to ask. They're family now, too." I looked at my son-in-law, at the man my daughter had chosen, and I told him as level as I could that this was still my house and my decision, and the answer right now was no. Dean and Shelby sat there looking uncomfortable, Shelby's eyes down on her plate, Dean turning his fork over and over like he wished he could disappear from the whole conversation. I don't think either of them had asked for this fight to happen at my table, and looking back, I still believe that. But Renee wasn't finished, and neither was Cole, and the temperature at that picnic table was about to climb a lot faster than I expected. Cole stood up so fast the bench scraped hard against the gravel underneath it. He pointed a finger at me the way I used to point a finger at Renee when she came home past curfew back in high school. "You're being selfish," he said, loud enough that the boys went quiet over at their little table. "This whole place just for you, and you can't do this one thing for people who actually need it." I told him to lower his voice, that there were kids around, but he kept going, saying I'd always been like this, always thinking about myself first, always making things harder than they needed to be. Renee chimed in right behind him, her voice climbing right along with his. "You've got 2 empty rooms, Dad," she said, nearly shouting it now. 2 rooms doing absolutely nothing while people I love are stuck sleeping on an air mattress, and you won't even think about it." I stayed in my seat. I stayed calm, because 29 years of running a hardware store counter and talking down angry customers over warranty returns had taught me that raising my own voice back only ever made things worse. I told them both, evenly, that this conversation was finished, that my house wasn't up for a vote at my own picnic table, and that if Dean and Shelby needed real help, we could talk about other options that didn't involve moving into my home. That was when Cole came around the table fast, grabbed my arm hard enough that I still had 4 dark fingerprint bruises on it 2 weeks later, and shoved me backward. I stumbled into the old china cabinet we'd carried out from the dining room to hold extra plates and cups for the party, and the back of my head caught the edge of the shelf as I went down. I heard glass crack somewhere behind me before I even registered the pain, and then I felt it, sharp and spreading, right at the base of my skull. For about 3 full seconds, nobody at that table moved. Cole's hand was still half raised where he'd shoved me. Renee's mouth was open like she couldn't quite process what her husband had just done. Shelby had both hands pressed over her own mouth. Dean was already up out of his chair, moving toward me even though nobody had asked him to. I touched the back of my head, felt something warm and wet under my fingers, looked at the blood on my hand, and then I did something that confused every single person standing over me. I smiled. Not a big smile, not dramatic, just small and calm. Because in that exact moment, sitting on the grass with my head throbbing and my own family staring down at me, I understood with total clarity that everything I had quietly prepared for over the last 3 months had just become necessary. I didn't have to wonder anymore if I'd been overreacting. Dad, Renee said, her voice cracking, are you okay? He didn't mean, and I held up my hand to stop her without saying a word. I got myself up using the edge of the table, walked past all of them into the mudroom, and took my jacket and truck keys off the hook by the garage door, pressing a folded dish towel against the back of my head the whole time to slow the bleeding. Where are you going? Renee called after me, somewhere between panic and confusion. I told her I was going to get checked out and that she should stay and take care of her family and her guests. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point any fingers or accuse anybody of anything out loud. I just walked out my own back door, blood soaking into a kitchen towel, and got into my truck in the driveway while my daughter stood in the doorway behind me, still not understanding what her husband had just started. The drive to the urgent care clinic on Route 9 took about 14 minutes, and I remember every single one of them clearly. I kept the towel pressed to the back of my head with one hand and drove with the other, careful and steady, the kind of calm that surprised even me given the circumstances. At the stoplight by the feed store, I reached into my jacket pocket with my free hand and pulled out my phone, and I typed out a short message to Carol Ann Voss, the attorney who'd been quietly preparing for this moment right alongside me without either of us knowing exactly when it would arrive. The message said only 3 words: contingency is active. I want to explain what that meant, because it wasn't some dramatic code out of a movie. It was simple and practical. 3 months earlier, after I'd started noticing the pattern of comments about my house and my empty rooms, I'd gone to Carol Ann and asked her what my options were if things ever went past uncomfortable conversation. She explained that guilt tripping and pressure, as ugly as they are, don't hold up in any legal sense on their own. But if something ever turned physical, even something that seemed small, that would be an entirely different matter, one with real weight behind it. We agreed that if that day ever came, my first move, before calling her, before calling anybody, was to get myself looked at by a medical professional and get any injury documented properly, because a record made in the moment carries an honesty that memories and arguments later on simply can't match. The contingency was never about revenge for its own sake. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't walk back, there'd be an honest account of exactly what happened, starting from the second it happened. I walked into the urgent care clinic with a bloody towel still pressed to my head, and a young man at the front desk took one look at me and had me back in an exam room within 5 minutes. Dr. Patel, a calm, thorough woman who couldn't have been much past 40, checked the wound and told me it was a laceration about an inch long, plus what she suspected was a mild concussion given how I described the impact, and that it would need staples to close properly. As she worked, she asked me routine questions: how it happened, whether I felt safe going home, and I answered honestly, telling her that my son-in-law had shoved me into a piece of furniture during an argument at a family cookout. Her expression didn't change much, but I could tell she'd heard versions of this story before and knew exactly what came next. She explained, gently but clearly, that clinic policy required her to notify law enforcement anytime a patient came in with an injury caused by another person, especially in a situation involving a possible family dispute, and that an officer would likely want to take a statement before I left. I told her that was fine, that I understood, and honestly, some part of me had already expected exactly that. While she put in 6 staples, working quick and careful, I sat there thinking about Patricia, about how she would have handled the whole mess, and I decided she probably would have come around that table swinging a serving spoon, which almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of getting stapled shut. About 25 minutes after Dr. Patel finished, a state trooper walked into my little curtained area, notepad already out, ready to hear what had happened. His name was Trooper Alan Marsh, a tall, unhurried man in his 30s, with the kind of patience that told me this wasn't his first time taking a report like mine. He asked me to walk him through the whole day, start to finish, and I did, keeping my voice level and my facts straight, not exaggerating anything, and not leaving anything out either. I told him about the request to move Dean and Shelby into my house, about my refusal, about Cole and Renee raising their voices, and about Cole grabbing my arm and shoving me into the china cabinet in front of everyone at that picnic table, including his own brother and my 2 young grandsons a few feet away. Trooper Marsh wrote it all down, occasionally asking a clarifying question: exactly where I'd been standing, how much force it looked like, whether it seemed like a shove or something that happened by accident in the middle of an argument. I told him honestly it looked deliberate to me, that Cole had grabbed my arm first and then pushed with both hands. He nodded and told me this would be filed as a report of simple assault, and that he'd be following up with Cole directly to get his side of things as well. While he finished writing, my phone kept buzzing over and over in my jacket pocket, Renee's name lighting up the screen each time. I didn't answer any of the calls, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say yet and didn't want to say the wrong thing while everything was still so raw. Trooper Marsh handed me his card before he left, told me to call if I remembered any other details, and said someone would follow up soon on next steps. That same evening, while I sat at home with a bandage on the back of my head and a dull ache that wouldn't quit, Trooper Marsh and his partner drove out to Cole and Renee's apartment to get Cole's side of the story, since that's standard procedure whenever a report like mine gets filed. I heard how that conversation went a few days later, partly from Renee and partly from Carol Ann, who had her own way of checking on the status of things. From what I was told, Cole tried to explain it as him just trying to catch me when I stumbled, insisting he'd never actually pushed me on purpose. The problem for him was that this didn't match what 3 other adults at that cookout had already told the trooper earlier that same evening, since Marsh had gotten brief statements from Renee, Dean, and Shelby before I ever left for the clinic. All 3 of them, even Renee, confirmed that Cole had grabbed my arm and shoved me with both hands, that I hadn't tripped or stumbled on my own. Trooper Marsh told Cole plainly that the injury, the witness accounts, and the bruising pattern on my arm didn't line up with an accidental version of events, and that the report would move forward as an assault charge, with the county attorney's office deciding how to proceed from there. I'm told Renee cried through most of that conversation, going back and forth between defending Cole and asking what would happen to their family now that they had 2 young boys at home. Cole, from what he told me himself much later, stood in the kitchen the whole time, barely saying a word, still trying to understand how one argument about spare bedrooms had turned into state troopers standing in his living room on the 4th of July. Over the following week, my phone rang constantly, mostly Renee, occasionally Cole, the voicemails swinging between apology and quiet anger, depending on the hour and who was calling. I let most of them go to voicemail while I focused on healing up and meeting with Carol Ann Voss to figure out what came next, because the contingency had only ever been the first step, not the whole plan. Sitting in Carol Ann's office about a week later, we talked through my options carefully. I told her I had no interest in dragging this out for years or punishing anybody beyond what the courts decided was fair for what had actually happened, but I also told her I was finished being treated like a spare housing solution by people who were supposed to love me. Carol Ann suggested we move on 2 fronts at once. First, a temporary no-contact order, giving both Cole's household and me some legally enforced distance while the assault charge worked its way through the system. Second, and more important to me personally, restructuring my estate so that the farmhouse and my savings would go directly into a trust for Tucker and Milo's future, administered by Carol Ann herself rather than by Renee or Cole, with me keeping full control and use of everything while I was still around. This wasn't about cutting my daughter out of my life or punishing my grandsons. It was about making sure nobody could ever again treat my home, my safety, or my money as something up for negotiation at a picnic table using pressure instead of respect. Carol Ann filed the paperwork within days, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally steering my own life instead of just reacting to whatever came at me next. About 3 weeks after the 4th, against Carol Ann's advice, and honestly against my own better judgment too, I let Renee and Cole come out to the farmhouse to talk in person. My staples had come out by then, leaving a thin, tender line at the back of my head that Dr. Patel said would fade, but probably never disappear entirely. Cole looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Renee looked worse. The 2 of them sat stiff on my porch swing while I sat across from them in the old rocker that used to be Patricia's. Cole apologized first, his voice unsteady, saying he never meant to hurt me, that he'd just gotten so frustrated in the moment, and it all came out wrong. I told him I believed he regretted it now. But that regret didn't undo what happened, and that putting your hands on another person, hard enough to draw blood, was never an acceptable way to settle a disagreement, no matter how frustrated you felt. Renee tried to jump in, asking if there was any way I could talk to the county attorney and make the charge go away. I told her plainly that this wasn't something I controlled anymore, that the state was handling it now, and Cole would have to face whatever the process decided was fair, same as anybody else would. I also told them both about the trust I'd set up for Tucker and Milo, explaining calmly that it wasn't a punishment. It was just me making sure my home and my money were protected for my grandson's future, instead of sitting there as something to argue over at family gatherings. Renee went quiet for a long stretch, looking out over the yard, and I could see something shifting behind her eyes. Somewhere between shame and finally understanding what her family had lost sight of over the past few months. Cole's court date came about 9 weeks later, and since it was his first offense with no prior record, the county attorney's office offered a plea deal instead of taking it to trial. He pleaded guilty to simple assault, and the judge handed down 80 hours of community service, a fine, and mandatory anger management counseling for 6 months. Along with the no contact order Carol Ann had already put in place, staying active for the same stretch. It wasn't dramatic, nothing like courtroom scenes on television, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened, one I honestly thought was fair given the circumstances. I didn't go to the hearing myself. I spent that afternoon out in the garden instead, since Carol Ann told me my written statement to the court had already said everything that needed saying. Word travels the way it always does in a small town like Millbrook, and I was surprised how many people reached out over the following weeks. My neighbor Ruth from down the road brought over a casserole one evening just to check on me. A fellow I used to sell hardware to for 30 years called just to make sure I was doing all right after hearing a version of the story secondhand. Nobody made me feel foolish for what happened, and nobody suggested I'd overreacted by calling it in, which meant more to me than I expected it to. Dean and Shelby, through a Veterans and Family Housing Assistance program that Carol Ann actually helped connect them with, since Dean had served 4 years in the Army Reserve, found a small apartment near Concord a couple of months later, something within their real budget that didn't require anybody's basement to make it work. Turned out there'd been a reasonable path forward the whole time, one that never needed to involve grabbing an old man by the arm or shoving him into a china cabinet. By early fall, things between Renee and me had started, slowly and carefully, to find some kind of new normal. She reached out on her own, without Cole, more than once, asking if we could just get coffee, the two of us. During those visits, she apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything disappear or downplay what had happened. She admitted she'd let her worry over Dean and Shelby pull her into pushing me in a way she wasn't proud of, and that watching Cole shove me into that cabinet had been the moment the whole thing finally looked as ugly to her as it actually was. I told her I appreciated hearing that, and that I still loved her. But that trust between us would need to rebuild slowly, the same way any broken trust does, through steady actions over time rather than one conversation on a porch swing. Cole and I spoke exactly once, right after the court proceedings wrapped up. A short, careful conversation where he thanked me, a little awkwardly, for not pushing the county attorney towards something harsher than what he got. I told him honestly that I hoped the counseling actually helped him, and that I hoped someday we could sit at a table together again without either one of us bracing for something. But that the timing of that wasn't only up to me anymore, and some doors take longer to open than others, especially the ones that got slammed shut that hard. I started seeing Tucker and Milo again on a regular schedule, usually just Renee bringing them out on Saturday mornings, and slowly that old tire swing under the maple started creaking with weight again, the way it always used to. It's been almost a year now since that 4th of July, and my life looks different than it did back then, quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The scar at the back of my head is mostly hidden by my hair these days, though I notice Renee's eyes drift toward it sometimes when we're talking, like she's remembering something she'd rather forget. The trust Carol Ann set up for the boys is still in place, still fully under my control while I'm around to use it, and I've made my peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold or selfish. It was simply responsible, the kind of thing Patricia would have wanted me to do for our grandsons without a single ounce of guilt hanging on it. I put in a bigger vegetable garden out past the barn this spring, tomatoes and squash mostly, the kind Patricia grew every single summer without fail, and some Saturday mornings Tucker helps me stake the tomato plants, while Milo chases the neighbor's dog around the yard until they're both worn out. Renee and I are building something real again, slower than either of us would probably like, but real, piece by piece, instead of pretending everything's fine the way we used to. I never went looking for revenge that 4th of July. Not really. Not in the dramatic way people usually mean when they use that word. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own safety, and my own decisions to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them more than anybody else. And sometimes protecting yourself calmly, honestly, and by the book is the only kind of payback that actually holds up over time. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with my story from start to finish. And if any part of it hit close to home, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Hit that like button and subscribe for more, because there are plenty more stories where this one came from.